She walked in with nothing but a quiet smile, an elderly black woman who had seen enough in life to deserve peace. But instead of kindness, she was met with cruelty. A store manager, filled with arrogance, raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed louder than anyone expected. Yet, what happened in the next few seconds wasn't just about her. It became a moment that would silence an entire room and expose a truth no one could ignore. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where no one expects anything unusual. The small neighborhood store buzzed with the usual rhythm: cash registers clicking, footsteps on the tiled floor, the faint hum of music playing in the background. Among the crowd, she moved slowly, but gracefully. An elderly black woman with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf. Her steps were steady, though age had clearly carved its mark on her body. She carried a small purse and a quiet dignity that spoke louder than words. For years, this store had been part of her routine. She had walked through its aisles countless times, picking up bread, milk, or whatever little she needed. Most of the workers recognized her. Some even smiled politely, though never too warmly. She had learned to live with those glances, the quick looks that judged her skin before knowing her story. On that day, she came only to buy a loaf of bread, nothing more. But in a world that often twists the simplest moments into something cruel, this ordinary trip was about to turn into something unforgettable. The shelves stood still. The lights flickered faintly, and across the room, one man, the store manager, watched her with eyes that carried something darker than impatience. The store manager leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his jaw set tight. To the casual eye, he might have looked like any other man doing his job. But his stare carried something heavier, an unspoken resentment, a sharpness that cut through the air. As the elderly woman reached for a loaf of bread, his voice sliced across the room. "You can't touch that, unless you pay first." Heads turned. Customers paused mid-step, sensing the shift in the air. The woman froze, her hand still resting gently on the bread, confusion spreading across her face. She had been shopping here for years. She knew the rules. She always paid. Still, his voice wasn't a warning. It was an accusation. Her lips trembled, but she stayed calm. "I was just going to—" "Don't argue," he snapped, his tone louder now, almost inviting the crowd to listen. "People like you think you can walk in and take whatever you want." The words hung in the air like poison. "People like you." She lowered her eyes, not out of guilt, but because she felt the sting of those words press deep. Around her, whispers began. Some customers looked away, uncomfortable, while others watched with thinly veiled curiosity, as if waiting to see how far it would go. She held the bread close to her chest, determined to keep her dignity intact. But the manager stepped closer, his shoes echoing against the tiled floor. The tension grew thick, pressing on every soul in the room. "You think I'm blind?" he sneered. "I've seen your type before. Always trying to sneak, always trying to cheat." She tried to steady her breath, but the humiliation was heavy. The world seemed to tilt. This was no longer about bread, it was about something far bigger. Each word from his mouth stripped away layers of humanity, reducing her to nothing more than a target. And then it happened. His hand, quick and merciless, rose and came crashing across her cheek. The sound cracked through the store like glass shattering. Gasps erupted. A child clutched her mother's hand tighter. Phones were pulled out, screens glowing as people began to record. The elderly woman staggered back, one hand pressed against her face, eyes welling not with tears of weakness, but with a deep, aching sorrow. The room seemed to freeze. The bread fell from her grip, landing silently on the cold floor. For a heartbeat, the manager stood tall, his chest heaving with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. But the silence that followed was not the silence of approval. It was the silence of judgment, heavy and suffocating. Something was shifting, though he did not yet know it. Justice was already on its way, hidden in the eyes of those who watched, waiting for the next moment to unfold. The sting of his slap still lingered in the air, echoing louder than the hum of the store's lights. For a moment, no one moved. The manager stood rigid, his chest swelling with the false pride of a man who thought he had proven his authority. But as his hand fell back to his side, the world around him began to shift. One by one, the customers lifted their phones higher, their lenses locked on him. A dozen silent witnesses turned into a dozen relentless recorders. He tried to stand taller, but the weight of those stares pressed on him, heavier than any law. The elderly woman, though shaken, did not crumble. Slowly, she straightened her back, her palms still pressed against her reddened cheek. Her silence screamed louder than any protest, her dignity unbroken even in the face of humiliation. And then, the first voice rang out. A young man near the dairy aisle shouted, "I saw everything! You hit her!" His words broke the silence like thunder. Others joined in, voices rising, weaving together in a storm of outrage. "She didn't steal anything. She comes here every week. You had no right." The manager's arrogance began to crack. His eyes darted from phone to phone, from face to face, searching for an ally, but finding none. He stammered, his voice shrinking under the weight of the crowd. She was stealing. I was just—" But no excuse could cover what they had seen. No words could erase the sound of that slap. At that moment, the store doors swung open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their radios buzzing. They hadn't come for the woman. They had been called by someone in the crowd, their arrival quicker than the manager ever imagined. The room held its breath. The cameras didn't blink, and as the officers turned their gaze toward him, the proud manager realized too late. The power he thought he owned had slipped from his grasp in seconds. The officers moved through the crowd, their presence heavy but focused. The manager's voice faltered as he tried again to explain, his hands trembling now where arrogance once lived. She was stealing, I swear," he muttered, but no one believed him. Dozens of witnesses stood ready, their phones glowing with undeniable proof. The elderly woman, still steady despite the sting on her cheek, remained silent. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to shout. The truth had already spoken for her, captured in every recording, echoed in every voice that stood up on her behalf. The officers turned to her gently, one asking if she was hurt, another guiding her to a chair. For the first time that afternoon, she felt seen, not as a suspect, not as a target, but as a human being who had endured more than her share of cruelty. The manager, on the other hand, was led away in front of the very customers he thought would stay silent. His authority crumbled in seconds, his reputation reduced to whispers of disgust and the piercing clarity of recorded evidence. The store slowly returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted. People looked at each other differently. Some with shame for staying quiet too long, others with pride for finally speaking up. The woman rose once more, her dignity unbroken, her spirit carrying a weight far heavier than a loaf of bread. And as she stepped outside into the fading daylight, the story didn't end with her. It began with us. Because what happened in that store wasn't just about one woman. It was about a truth we all carry. Injustice can happen anywhere, to anyone, in an instant. The real question is, when it does, will we have the courage to stand against it?